No ease up, squeeze up, pop it off. No ease up, you fit defend your own self. No
All right.
ease up.
I was able to meet with Jennifer Ruggles at her town hall meeting on the 24th of September 2018 to ask some questions about the Geneva Convention and these international laws that a lot of these Kingdom of Hawaii people are referencing. I got an answer that I wasn't expecting, and I want to address that. So let me get into that really quick, and then I'll address her response as well as the response from I believe his name is Dr. Kai. But let me just clarify this really quick, and then I'll respond.
Had State of Hawaii agree upon and sign.
Okay. Thanks.
So first, thank you. I am new to Hawaii. I've only been here for a few months. I don't consider myself a citizen really of anywhere. I've been to 12 countries this year. I don't believe in borders. I don't believe in a lot of this. So, when it comes to nations and things like that, I believe that we're humans and we live on planet Earth. That's my philosophy. But what I'm looking at is the international law, which you brought up a lot of good points that I didn't know about before. But what I'm seeing here is that in 1949, we're talking about the Hague Convention and the Geneva Convention, but we're talking about treaties that were established long before that in 1873 and things like that. So I'm just wondering how retroactively can international law go back? So there's been a lot of treaties violated, not only by the US, but by every country. I mean, even in Hawaii, there was a lot of wars for 900 years. Maui took Hawaii, Hawaii took Maui, and Oahu, and back and forth. There was a lot of wars and a lot of conquests. So there's been conquests for all of human history. So if we're talking about a 1949 law and international law, how far can that go back, and how many wrongs can we right with that law? Is it even possible? So thank you.
Great question. As I learned and read about the Geneva Conventions and how they relate to the 1800s, is back then they weren't actually in writing, but there were customary traditions that were considered to be international law that the countries agreed upon. And those were codified in the first Geneva Convention, but they still existed before then. But as far as how far back that goes,
that's a good question, because when you look at the first Hague Convention, it was actually 1899. But the overthrow of the Hawaiian government was 1893, so that's 6 years before, right? And then the 1899 Hague Convention was superseded in 1907, which is what we currently know today, and which the United States refers to in Title 18, Section 2441, as far as war crimes. So violations of the 1907 Hague Conventions and the 1949 Geneva Conventions constitute war crimes. So how does that apply to 1893? And I covered this in my dissertation as well, right? And it's recognized principle. You have what is called customary international law. Now, customary international law is where each country accepts. Now, every country has to accept it as the law to be custom, right? If you have a few holdouts, it's not recognized. When I speak of customary international law, I'm referring to international law, which applies to independent states, not every other nation. So when Kamehameha conquered Oahu through the Battle of Nu'uanu, that was not under or regulated by international law. That was actually regulated by the kapu, which is the legal system that existed at that time. Now, once Kamehameha I joined the British Empire in 1794, you folks notice the Union Jack is on the flag? Hawaii wasn't a colony. It was actually part of the British Empire. Hawaii joined the British Empire. Now it became of Great Britain, and now international law would apply. So you actually see some letters, a couple letters that were sent to King George III from Kamehameha, asking him about his neutrality and protection from the British, right? Because a lot of people were at war with the British Empire, okay? Now, once Hawaii became an independent state in 1843, when Great Britain recognized it, then Hawaii became a part of international law, which began in 1843. And the customary practices that applied to England or Great Britain would now also apply to the Hawaiian Kingdom. Now, what happened in the 1860s was the move toward codifying the laws of war. And actually the first country to actually begin that codification was the United States in, I believe, 1863, the Lieber Code. 1861, the Lieber Code. Lieber actually came up with the laws of war that was applied during the Civil War. That was then later picked up by Europe, and they began to have conferences in Brussels, 1872, I believe, right? And then Oxford began to address it. And that culminated in the first conference in 1899 in The Hague, Netherlands, which included the United States, where they're all going to agree to the Hague Convention, which codifies existing customary law, not new law, right? And it is recognized that the Hague Convention is merely codification of existing law. That's important to know. And then it was superseded in 1907. And then when we have 1949 Geneva Conventions, the reason why the countries got together in Geneva to address the Geneva Conventions was because of the maltreatment and murders of civilians during World War II. That was the reason for the Geneva Conventions to be formed. And in particular, Geneva Convention number 4, the 4th Geneva Convention that applies to civilians, which you saw Jennifer referring to. That's where that came from. Because prior to 1949, civilians weren't really protected. They were subject to their country to protect them. When the Geneva Convention came out in 1949, they said, no, this applies to protect civilians in all circumstances. Even if one country says they annexed the territory, they said the convention still applies because that's still occupied territory. Now that part right there was making specific reference to what Germany was doing in unilaterally annexing Luxembourg, Belgium. And they said, no, that's all illegal. So Hawaii became a part of international law from 1843, not before, okay? And to give you an idea of how many countries actually existed in 1893, independent states, there were only 44. Today, the UN is made up of 193. In 1945, when the UN was formed, only 46 countries, 46 independent states. The reason why you had more members of the UN was because these countries were decolonizing their empires, right? So East Timor became an independent state that used to be a Portuguese colony, right? So that's what you started to have. For Hawaii, though, these laws definitely apply, but it only applies if Hawaii was an independent state in 1893 when its government was illegally overthrown. And that is already confirmed. It was an independent state. Now we're dealing with the ramifications of that with regard to international law.
Oh boy, was that a loaded response with a lot of historical inaccuracies and unprovable history. So when he says that Hawaii joined the British Empire, that is absolutely untrue. Now, at first, King George III sent Kamehameha a British flag as a sign of friendship. However, the union between the two was never ratified. There was never an official adoption of Hawaii by Great Britain at all. And I'm going to put some reference points here. So, I mean, you can look at this yourself. I mean, the whole history is disputed on whether this happened or this happened. There's really not a whole lot, of official anything involved here. However, if we look at British Parliament, where things are recorded, there was never a ratification of this adoption of Hawaii into the British Kingdom. And then if you look further, he talks about the flag, how the Union Jack was raised above Kamehameha I's home, only to be taken down, and to placate the Americans during the 1812 war, they raised an American flag over Kamehameha's home. So if there's any sign that, the flag raising of the Union Jack was an adoption of British rule, well then later it would be, the American flag would be raised above Kamehameha's home as well. So does that mean that he ceded the adoption of British rule in favor of American rule when that flag was raised? So you can see here in 1816, Kamehameha commissioned his own flag to avoid the conflict. So afterwards, they, adopted a new flag, which symbolized part of their friendship, as part of a symbol of friendship. That is basically the same flag as in 1816 with minor differences. The flag of 1896 is the state of Hawaii's flag as of today, which has an adoption of all three nations' flags. So look at this here. The various accounts of the earliest history of the flag of Hawaii. One relates to how King Kamehameha I flew the British flag, probably a red ensign given to him by British explorer Captain George Vancouver as a token of friendship with King George III. Subsequent visitors reported seeing the flag flying from places of honor, and it was written then considered an official Hawaiian flag. As the Union Jack added diagonal red cross of St. Patrick in 1801, so did the flag of Hawaii. An advisor of Kamehameha noted the Union flag could draw Hawaii into an international conflict, and his kingdom could be seen as an ally of the United Kingdom, and he subsequently lowered the Union Jack flag over his home in Kamakanhu. While disputed as historically accurate, one account stated that in order to placate U.S. interests during the War of 1812, a flag of the U.S. was raised over Kamehameha's home, only to be removed when British officers in the court of Kamehameha vehemently objected to it. This explains why the resulting flag of Hawaii was deliberately hybrid between the two nations' flags. In 1816, Kamehameha commissioned his own flag, which has evolved into the current flag. It was probably designed by one of the commanders of the Royal Hawaiian Navy, former officers of the British Royal Navy, who advised Kamehameha based on a form of the British naval flag. There is a debate as to the actual designer. Some credit Alexander Adams, other George Carls Beckley. It was very similar to the flag of the British East India Company in use about this time, which only had red and white stripes. Captain Adams used a flag for the first time on Hawaiian trade mission in China in 1817. The original flag was designed to feature stripes alternating in the order of red, white, and blue, also attributing various historical flags of the United Kingdom. The flag used at the first official flying of the flag of Hawaii erroneously placed stripes in the order of white, red, and blue, although it seems explorers of the island disagree about the exact order of the colors and the number of stripes up until the 1840s. There may have been a possible different versions of the flag with different numbers of stripes and colors. The number of stripes also changed. Originally, the flag was designed with either 7 or 9 horizontal stripes, and in 1845 it was officially changed to 8 stripes. The latter arrangement was adopted and is used today. So when we talk about this historical adoption of Hawaii by Great Britain, there's no evidence of that. Show me in British Parliament where that exists. Show me any written history of that. This is all disputed because there's nothing that solidified this in any legal standard. There's no written parliamentary adoption that I can find, and other people are also having the same problem, which is why I pulled up a few more articles here. This guy's dissertation I would love to read. I have not yet read it. I believe his name is Dr. Kai. I could be wrong, but I'm going to get into his research a little bit more later. However, all other accounts that I've been able to find does not corroborate his story whatsoever. So beyond that, and I am fascinated by his interpretation of all of this, beyond all of that, he is saying that the Geneva Convention and the Hague Convention, of which they reference articles that were drafted in 1949, like Article 64 of the Geneva Convention is one they used about treaty violations and things like that. Those were adopted in 1949. So my question was, how can all of these international conventions or laws apply to something that happened 70 years before? And if it can apply to something 70 years before, can it also apply to something 170 years before? 270 years before, 900 years before? Because if so, the brutal and terrible battles that King Kamehameha waged on Maui and Oahu and others, and vice versa, where, you know, Maui invaded Hawaii, the Hawaii island, island of Hawaii, that is. You know, if this reverts back to the kingdom of Hawaii or the Hawaii kingdom, then which side does it go to? Does it go to Maui? Does it go to Oahu? Does it go to Hawaii? These were all warring factions, separate but warring factions. And they say, oh, no, these were just separate tribes. They were just having little battles. No, these were major battles, genocidal battles, where thousands and thousands of people were killed in order for, you know, expanding borders, conquest. You know, King Kamehameha wanted control over the entire island chain. He wanted more hunting ground. He wanted more resources. He wanted more power. And he took it from his neighbors. All right, so this isn't a racial thing for me, although the Kingdom of Hawaii, who was present at the meeting, absolutely it is a racial thing. You know, they want Polynesians only, and this is evident in Miss Melanie, I think I'm pronouncing her name right, Melanie Trask, Miss Melanie Trask, and other Kingdom of Hawaii leaders and scholars say this is a very racial thing, that Hawaii should be governed by Hawaiians only, that Japanese and Americans and others cannot buy Hawaiian land, cannot occupy Hawaiian land, blah, blah, blah. All right, fine. So if all of this is true, where is the proof? Where is the evidence? One last thing I wanted to mention was here's that letter from Queen Liliuokalani when she yielded her throne under protest. So this was the overthrow part. But it has some legal implications. She says, I, Liliuokalani, by grace of God, under the Constitution of Hawaiian Kingdom, Queen, do hereby solemnly protest against any and all acts done against myself and the constitutional government of the Hawaiian Kingdom by certain persons claiming to have established provisional government and for this kingdom, that I yield to the superior force of the United States of America, whose minister, Plenipotentiary, His Excellency John L. Stevens, has caused United States troops to be landed at Honolulu and declared that he would support the said provisional government. Now, to avoid any collision of armed forces and perhaps loss of life, I do, under this protest and impelled by the said forces, yield my authority until such time as the government of the United States shall, upon the facts being presented to it, undo the actions of its representative and reinstate me in authority, which I claim as the constitutional sovereign of the Hawaiian Islands. So with that condition, she left it up to the United States to make the decision, I think. So I don't know. I mean, in international law, does that mean that prior to these international laws being established, and in the words of her, and this is something that Jennifer Ruggles brought up, is does yield mean temporarily, or does yield mean, you know, permanently, and then with her subsequent words, until the government decides in her favor? Well, what if they never decide in her favor? What if they decide that they will never unyield their power back to her? So, and then also, like I said, with these laws being written, like Article 64 of the Geneva Convention and other articles that came far after this 1893 overthrow, as we'll call it. I'll concede to that it was certainly an overthrow, a forceful overthrow. But does international law, post-dated to 70 years later, retroactively apply? That's what I don't understand. And beyond all of this, if the Hawaiian Kingdom is restored, and perhaps the Kingdom of Hawaii gets their racially based government and their racially based nation, how does that affect the future of Hawaii? Does that leave them defenseless? Would the United States still have to provide their defense? What about the massive amount of people on benefits from the United States? How are they going to survive? There's so many people that are dependent on the system. Would there be some sort of a safety net for them? And if so, where would it come from? As I understand it, most of the food to the Hawaiian Islands come from outside of the islands. They don't make most of their food here. It comes from elsewhere. So how does that play out? With the lack of funding, with the lack of defense, and with the lack of food, what then becomes of Hawaii if, Jennifer Ruggles and the Kingdom of Hawaii and others get what they want out of this? And I don't know. That's my concerns with it. I do wonder how the conclusion was made that Hawaii was adopted by Britain when there's no record of this. Just a flag being flown, whereas in 1812, the United States flag was flown over King Kamehameha's house. So if the king at the time flies the British flag, and that means that Hawaii is a part of Great Britain and has adopted Britain as its sovereign, does it then mean that when Hawaii flies the American flag in 1812 that they ceded that adoption of Britain as their sovereign to the United States, and then the United States became their sovereign? That's what I want to know. I don't think any of these questions were really answered at the meeting. I tried to get to the bottom of it, but it seemed escuffated by the professor, or the good Dr. Kai. I believe his name was Kai. He didn't really seem conclusive on evidence. He was alluding to disputed history, but nothing concrete. So I'm still confused.